Senator, thank you for being here.
Good to be with you, Ravi. Thank you.
So, money is going to be a theme through the next 3 hours of this event. Let me start with that. I mean, America really did well, I think, in the last year to push through ambitious climate legislation, even though it was strangely named under the Inflation Reduction Act. But the reality is that we need a lot more. We need trillions, not billions. And as a politician who cares about this issue, how do you think America can do more? How can it mobilize more money?
The immediate things that are in process are a social cost of carbon that is coming up through EPA as part of the methane regulation, which the Biden administration assures me will be deployed executive branch wide by OMB as soon as it becomes law through the APA process. The United States government is a big organization. It sends big economic signals. If everything from purchasing to permitting to licensing to regulation is connected to a significant social cost of carbon, it's about $120. That's a very powerful addition to a successful deployment of the IRA. The third thing that's happening is that the EU has pushed the CBAM forward.
What's that?
The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So that's basically an international price on carbon between different national economies to reward those that are investing well and being successful in reducing carbon emissions and charge for their negligence those that are not. If the U.S. welcomes and joins with that, that would probably be the most powerful single signal that we could send. And it sends the signal internationally because the tariffs are international.
Right.
So if you have a well-executed IRA, a government-wide social cost of carbon that is robustly implemented, and U.S. and EU, and potentially UK, Australia, Canada, others, engagement with the EU carbon border adjustment, we're not home free at that point, but a path to climate safety begins to emerge. And at the moment, there is no path to climate safety.
You know, in this town at least, every time we refer to the IRA, we call it ambitious. We say it's the biggest climate change legislation this country's seen.
Yeah, which is great, but like low bar, because we've never done any serious climate legislation.
Exactly. But there are also many critics of the IRA, especially in Europe. Economists, for example, will say that it's not going to be that effective because when you couch climate legislation in the guise of job creation or innovation, centuries of economic history will show that doesn't always work out. So how do you think the IRA is actually working on the things it was designed to do?
We will see, but the estimates are that we add 15 percentage points of emissions reduction towards our goal from this. That still leaves a long road to go, but it's the first measurable reduction in emissions from a piece of legislation. And I think you're seeing on the European side, while they seem to resent a bit the America First aspect of it, and they fear a migration of jobs to the United States, our position has been a fairly strong one, which is, hey, if you don't like it, meet us or beat us. And if they do that, and Minister von der Leyen has been saying that that's what she wants to do, then I think they move in our direction. That adds to the emissions effect, and it's a good result. Not to mention that us telling them, go pound sand, meet us or beat us, you know, we're not interested in your whining, would actually be a really good thing for them to say to us about the carbon border adjustment. So if we get both of those going and there's a reciprocal impatience with laggards, then I think some good things begin to happen internationally as well as within the country.
You know, for those of you in the audience, for those of you watching online, you've got our print magazine right in front of you, and the cover story actually refutes some of what you're saying, Senator. Respectfully, it points out that when you have a subsidies race, that often doesn't lead to innovation, it often leads to corruption. We don't need to discuss that now, but there's
that potential, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be effective, and the far stronger view from people who look at this very professionally is that there will in fact be significant emissions reductions because it will facilitate the transition off of fossil fuels to other fuels and overcome the rather corrupt counterpressure from the fossil fuel industry.
Let me ask you this, since we're talking about money, and as I look ahead to COP28 later this year, the Loss and Damage Fund that I think generated so much excitement at COP27, not much money has gone into that fund yet. I think the phrase empty basket has been used. How do you get Americans, I mean, say in your constituency in Rhode Island, how do you convince people to contribute money to very real loss and damages in, say, Pakistan or Bangladesh?
Well, there's a very legitimate question about how much of this should be on other governments as opposed to on the industry that is actually busy causing the problem and corrupting government efforts to cure the problem. So the fossil fuel industry bears enormous responsibility in this area. As a result of the way they can set prices through cartel, they have manufactured enormous revenues for themselves. The $11 billion that was promised and then not provided by the United States is a tiny slice of their annual profits last year. I think it's very important in order to sell the idea that we need to support these other countries to make sure that the right people are making the contribution. And I think the fossil fuel industry has a high level of responsibility for the problem and is trying to push off to governments the responsibility for the solution, which is their basic behavioral model.
How do you flip that dynamic?
Carbon price. Make them pay for it.
And how do you see that working? How much revenue?
Well, not very well yet, because so far they've been quite successful in convincing folks that the government should solve this problem that they made, and that they should just keep the proceeds. What do they call it? Socialize the harms and privatize the profits.
Yeah.
So I think we need to push back at that. It's a much easier sell, I think, if the fossil fuel industry plays a significant part in paying for the harm that the fossil fuel industry caused.
And how do you, again, make that happen in this town? This town that we all love, that's, full of all kinds of stakeholders with various interests. How do you get that point across? How do you make it happen?
Well, winning elections helps a lot. Unfortunately, I'll be blunt about this, the Republican Party has essentially become the political wing of the fossil fuel industry. Just take a look at the plan that Speaker McCarthy has put forward, virtually the whole thing. I mean, I think we counted 280 out of 320 pages is all handouts to the fossil fuel industry. And if you look at how the Republican Party is funded, it's almost entirely fossil fuel dark money. So there's a very unhealthy relationship between the Republican Party and the fossil fuel industry, and that prevents progress because that's what the fossil fuel industry wants to do. So frankly, it's going to take another round of Democratic control in both houses with the ability to use reconciliation as we did. I mean, it's kind of saddening that we couldn't get a single Republican vote for the climate measures of the Inflation Reduction Act. Not one.
I'm a journalist, so it's my job to push you here, Senator.
Push away.
Hasn't your party not done its job in bringing this to the people in the right way? If this is about elections, if everything you're saying makes sense on paper, why doesn't that translate to common, sensible people around this country who should, on paper, agree with you, but then don't at the ballot box?
Well, I complain within the party nonstop that we could and should do more, and it would do us well to do more. But it's not easy. I mean, you're up against an industry that the IMF says enjoys a $660 billion annual subsidy just in the United States alone. So if they're going to spend $6.6 billion a year in politics, that's a 100-to-1 earnings on that $1 invested. And that is a very, very powerful motivation. So they have an entire flotilla of phony front groups out there who spread their message, We see the witnesses come in who propagate their nonsense and their propaganda. I mean, we're up against a very robust effort that has its own news channel to deploy the message. So yes, we could and should do more, and I argue with my colleagues about that all the time. But I think to blame the Democratic Party for not having been more successful in getting things done, when on the other side you have this absolute blockade being run by the fossil fuel industry, is not parity.
Well, we'll hear from them too. You have your tough task set out for you. I'm up against a clock, so I think we're done there. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thanks for having me on, Ravi.
Thanks for your time.
Best wishes.
Great to hear from you. All the best.